Uh, Good evening and welcome. I'm Dean Deniston, Chair of the King's Chapel Memorial Project, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation by members of the King's Chapel Memorial Project and the Mass Design Group. This evening, we will provide you with an update on our efforts to acknowledge and memorialize King Chapel's historical connection with enslaved individuals, as well as provide specific steps for moving forward. We will also introduce you to the Mass Design Group, an architectural firm with national and international experience in justice-based design. We have, I'm sorry for stopping because I'm getting feedback every once in a while, so I apologize. We have asked Mass Design to partner with us and to provide a public presentation to the congregation outlining their experience with physical and living memorials and how they might be able to help us if we were to engage them as consultants. I had a list of housekeeping activities, but that was already done by Joy, but just let me go over them again real quickly. This presentation is being recorded so that it'll be made available to folks who are unable to be here this evening. We ask that you stay muted throughout the presentation and only unmute yourself when you're going to be talking. And at the end of the presentation, the entire presentation, there will be a question answer period for you to raise questions, commentary, concerns, and any of that. And we really encourage you to ask questions. So at this point, I'm going to ask Miguel Gomez-Abanez, Chair of the Physical Memorial Subcommittee, to begin the presentation. Miguel, you better unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah, I did. I just did. Thank you, Dean.
Okay.
And thanks everybody for showing up, and thanks Mass Design for working so hard to make this presentation what it's going to be. And Cliff Allen is my co-conspirator as chair of the Living Memorial. This presentation focuses on that, on the physical more than that, but they're both completely connected. And so all of this is part of a single effort on, we hope, the church's part to memorialize our history with slavery. So I'd like to just start by summarizing our thinking as we were approaching this problem. King's Chapel is a community of people of faith with very diverse backgrounds and theologies, but we're grounded in a shared Christian values and by our covenant, which you're going to see in a slide if Chris will be good enough to share the presentation. We'll go to the next slide. We hope. The covenant is, nope. The covenant is what we all ascribe to in the love of truth and the spirit of Jesus Christ. We unite for the worship of God and the service of all. We're also a community of faith that's grounded in our history, and it's a history which you can see and feel and appreciate every time you enter the church. And it's a history that we've always been proud to share with the public through our visitors program. If you're like me, you grew up completely unaware that slavery was present in 17th and 18th and even early 19th century Boston, and unaware of the extent to which the Boston economy benefited from slavery, and King's Chapel in particular, and some of its parishioners also benefited as well. Given this evolving understanding of our history and our position as an important historic site on Boston's Freedom Trail, and our longstanding commitment to presenting our history as well as our faith to the many thousands of Freedom Trail visitors. And finally, our commitment to Christian values, as I say, and the love of truth that we describe in our covenant, then it seems that the inevitable response is to seek a way to treat our less admirable but important aspects of history, just as we have treated so many other aspects of our history, with memorials to our congregational ancestors and to their actions. And we're not doing this to reject our past or repudiate anybody. As our assistant minister has said in our meetings, we're doing this with the abiding confidence in God's love for us, for those who led this church in the past, and for everyone who has ever entered the church, regardless of status, of color, or gender, or sexuality, or nationality. So with that as a preface, let me just recap the recommendations of the Physical Memorial Committee. We propose to honor the enslaved people connected to King's Chapel's past by creating a memorial that consists of both a physical aspect and a programmatic aspect. The physical aspect of the memorial would consist of a physical commemorative installation. The programmatic aspect of the memorial would consist of a substantial fund established to facilitate the work of repair and justice in the community. In both of these aspects, we seek to create a memorial that honors those enslaved persons connected to King's Chapel by commemorating their lives, by telling the truth about our history, and by doing the work of repair and justice. And if we're successful, we envision a memorial that will serve as a site for reflection, a catalyst for conversation, an inspiration for activism, and a beacon of hope. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Faye Charpentier, who will give us a brief summary of her extensive research into slavery at King's Chapel. She's been working for 5 years on this, as I understand, and working closely with the committee, and it is her research that has informed what we're trying to do. So Faye, thanks very much, and it's yours.
Great, thanks, Miguel. Next slide. So at the heart of the memorial project are 219 people, at least 219 people, who were enslaved by congregants and clergy of King's Chapel, and in many cases brought to the church by the person who enslaved them. Their names and stories have long been absent from our church histories and contemporary understandings until recent years. The erasure of enslaved and free people of color is evident across our walls of our church, where only white names and faces are found across the many memorials and monuments. Through this memorial project, we hope that recognizing the presence of enslaved and free persons of color in our church's history will be one of many means of denouncing the brutal systems that attempted to strip them of their humanity, recognizing their dignity as human beings, and remembering those whose forced labor secured the wealth of our congregants that funded our building. There's much more additional research, as we've shared in our advertisements and announcements for this available on our website. But today I'll highlight some of our history before turning the presentation over to Mass Design. So next slide. So through ongoing research, we now know the names of 182 individuals of color and an additional 37 people whose names were excluded from the historical record. And these are just some of the examples of those sources on your screen here. Next slide. So this research began in our church records, scouring vital registers such as the baptismal records, as well as wardens and vestry records. With these initial names uncovered through these church records in this initial research process, we completed further research into probate and property records of church members, which helped deepen our understandings of history's enslavement within the church's historic community. Next slide. As a result of this research, over the past 5 years or so, we've begun to grapple with the difficult truth of King's Chapel's history with enslavement and racial injustice. By the time King's Chapel was established in 1686, slavery was an integral part of the economic and social fabric of Boston. At least 71 enslavers were directly connected to King's Chapel leading up to the American Revolution, including our ministers, congregants, and many of the church's elected lay leaders, including members of the wardens and vestry. Many of the enslaved people who worshiped at King's Chapel and gallery pews within the church. And the first vote of the vestry, as our stone sanctuary opened in August of 1754, was to segregate seating within the building. Our church members also profited from slavery, as did most Bostonians during the colonial period. Most directly, though, a large portion of the funds used to build the stone church used for worship today came from donors who were slaveholders as well as slave traders. Next slide. The construction and continued preservation of King's Chapel is directly linked with slavery and the colonial slave trade. Nearly 70% of the initial funding for constructing the chapel came from donors whose wealth was dependent on enslaved labor or who worked in trades tied with enslavement. At least 40% of the chapel's funding can be directly linked to enslavers and slave traders. And as I said, nearly 70% of funding for this building came from people whose livelihood depended on slavery, including merchants who sold goods produced by enslaved people, rum distillers who depended on Caribbean sugar harvested by enslaved men and women, and those who worked in the New England shipping industry itself. Support for our building also came from plantation owners living in places like Jamaica and Barbados, through special appeal letters sent by King's Chapel with the help of slave trading families, including the vassals. Next slide. I'll address the existing memorials in King's Chapel directly a bit later on, but for the portraits shown here from left to right are Isaac Royal Jr., Peter Faneuil, Governor William Shirley, Charles Apthorpe, and Henry Vassall, which illustrate whose voices and members were and have continued to be privileged throughout the church's history. Yet each man pictured here personally profited from slavery through their direct involvement in the colonial slave trade. And as mentioned before, each contributed that wealth to our church. Our sanctuary would not exist without this funding linked to enslavement. Dominant historical narratives lining the walls of this church in the form of memorials to both enslavers and literal slave traders, like the men pictured here, obscure the reality of our history with slavery. And for too long, these faces have overshadowed the stories of enslaved men and women at the church. Next slide. Through the work of this memorial project, we strive to disrupt those dominant narratives and bring the names and stories of enslaved people connected to the church back into focus, commemorating their lives, telling the truth about our history, and doing the work of repair and justice. Next slide. So the quote at the bottom of the screen here comes from Senator Charles Sumner, who had formerly been a member of King's Chapel. And it describes, quote, the unholy union between the cotton plantations and flesh mongers of Louisiana and Mississippi and the cotton spinners and traffickers of New England, between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. Although slavery in Massachusetts ended in the 1780s, New Englanders, including those at King's Chapel, continued to profit from slavery through their deep ties to the booming textile industry. King's Chapel members helped introduce the power loom to the United States and played key roles in establishing the famed Lowell Mills and Mills in Waltham. Slavery on Southern cotton plantations fueled these mills and in turn produced the wealth that these families used to support the church community and purchase pews. The powerful economic and social status of such men and families likely contributed to the hesitance at some Boston churches, including King's Chapel in the 19th century, to speak out on contemporary issues of slavery from the pulpit. Throughout this period leading up to the Civil War, King's Chapel as an institution and a community of faith were offered many opportunities to take a stance against slavery, yet chose at best to remain silent and at worst to uphold Southern slavery, as well as uphold the fugitive slave laws in Boston. Next slide. And as we look towards a new memorial, it's important to consider the existing memorials within King's Chapel. The sanctuary is home to 35 memorials and monuments dating as far back as the 1750s when the building was first completed. Looking closely at the memorials in the church, some of which are pictured here, we see the names of 52 people total, all white and predominantly men. The memorials currently in the church include memorials honoring a known slave trader, a memorial installed by family wealth derived from enslaved labor on Jamaican sugar plantations, and 3 memorials honoring textile industrialists who heavily profited from the Southern slave economy. These memorials paint a picture of who was present throughout King's Chapel's history, whose voices matter and are still privileged today, and who is worthy of remembrance. That is in stark contrast to the reality of the church's history. The erasure of Black history and sweeping over of difficult truths of our past is acutely experienced at King's Chapel through this current memorial landscape. It's how we're surrounded when folks come to worship at King's Chapel, as well as what every visitor sees when they experience the church, and it sends a strong message. Our memorial efforts are informed by our history. And as Miguel stressed earlier, we seek to create a memorial that honors those enslaved persons connected to King's Chapel by commemorating their lives, telling the truth about our history, and doing the work of repair and justice. So I'll turn it back over to Miguel.
Thank you very much, Faye. And I'm here just to turn it back over to Chris. And Chris, I'm trying fooling with Chris. Thanks very much for all your help, as I said earlier, and we're very hopeful that we'll be able to work with you. So you're just about to explain to everybody why we're so anxious to cooperate, to coordinate and to partner with you. So take it away. But you got to.
Yes, thank you very much, Miguel. I first have to say how wonderful it is to see familiar faces amongst all of you. I'm Chris Scoville. I'm a senior architect and director with Mass Design Group. As most of you know, and some may surmise by my name, my family's been very closely connected to King's Chapel for over 55 years, I believe. I'm working on this project at Mass Design Group with my colleague, Janea Asazi, who is the director of Mass's Public Memory and Memorial Lab. She's a little delayed in getting to us because of some travel difficulties, but may join us at the end of this presentation. I'm also very glad to be joined by my new colleague, Brandon Bibby. And Brandon, you want to say hello and introduce yourself at this point?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Bibby. I'm an architect and Space and Society Fellow. I just joined Mass pretty recently, so excited to be joining you guys.
Thank you, Brandon. So I'm going to start first by introducing Mass Design Group and our presentation. So we're going to start by explaining who we are, what is Mass Design Group, how does Mass Design Group work. We'll tell you, in a sense, where we are after Faye's very excellent introduction to where King's Chapel is. We'll sort of give a brief overview of where we are sort of in the larger culture in terms of our collective memory. And then, you know, we'll end with sort of aspirationally what we can be with this idea of spatializing memory, which is at the heart of memorial work, how contemporary memorial precedents to slavery and injustice have been done by others, how Mass has done public memory and memorial lab work, and then also phases of memorial development, how we might move forward specifically with you. So Mass as an organization sort of offers the provocation and the healthy provocation that design is never neutral, that it either hurts or it heals. MASS is a mission-based organization, and our mission is to research, design, and build and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. So we do an enormous amount of hospital work, we do education work, we do housing work, we do this work in East Africa and West Africa, we've worked in Haiti, and we've worked in other locations. We work with a lot of nonprofit organizations, and we help those organizations amplify their missions. MASS is very truly the most diverse and rich organization I have ever had the privilege to work with. We are over 200 architects, landscape architects, engineers, writers, filmmakers, researchers. We once had a full-time epidemiologist on our staff, which was extraordinary for a design practice. And we represent over 20 countries across the globe. So in terms of our process, planning, design, and construction are the common phases of architectural work. MASS provides these services, but also as a mission-driven nonprofit organization, whenever possible, we provide additional services, visioning on the front end, and then evaluation on the back end of those more standard services. And we do that on many of our projects as a mission-driven organization. And as a not-for-profit, MASS can provide these expanded services beyond the core design and construction phases that many design professionals offer, but are understandably limited to those because design and construction services are more profitable for design offices. And as a non-for-profit, we can provide services that don't have traditional sort of operate in the traditional profit mechanism on many of our projects. So, excuse me. So where we are, so let's move on to the next phase then. So where we are and contextualizing memory. And this is where, Bibby, I think you can step in and please take over the presentation.
Thanks, Chris. So over the past decade, MASS has worked with project partners in the US and across the globe on several projects that explore new ways to shift narratives, serve as catalysts for truth-telling, and advance collective healing through the built environment. Just last year in 2020, we received a grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation to establish and develop the Public Memory and Memorial Lab, which advances research, training, and design around the central thesis that spatializing memory can heal us and inspire collective action for generations to come. Memory is one of the most effective forms of human consciousness. So whether individual or collective, the experiences from joyous to traumatic all shape the way that we live with ourselves and with each other. So next slide. Worldwide, memory and history in built form, whether it's memorials, monuments, street names, or plaques, carry a responsibility to communicate the complex histories and provide spaces for healing. Built in them is the power to remind us about who we once were so that we can understand who we are and so that we might decide who we want to become in the future. Next slide. The construction of public memory lends weight to particular narratives that bring us to ask who or what is deemed important, whose voices are we hearing, and who is left out. Here, an image we all know quite well in the controversies surrounding its composition and placement here in Boston. Next slide. We take the Lincoln Memorial and compare it here to the Shaw Memorial, and we find that their compositions are not too dissimilar. Yet one was challenged to the point of removal, and at the same time, the other is seen here as a symbol of hope and triumph. So again, we ask ourselves how spatializing memory through this new understanding of memorials and monuments can heal us and inspire collective action for generations to come. Next slide. Now, debatedly more than ever here in America, there is a public shift happening in the memorial landscape as we develop a more comprehensive and collective understanding of who we are and reconcile with the histories that contributed to the injustices that we face today. However, we must also understand that the challenge that we are facing is not new. An audit that was done by the Mellon Monument Lab attributes the first monument removal here in the US to 1776, when civilians pulled down a statue of King George III as a symbol of the rise of new social values and shift in American culture. And we even saw that here in Boston. Next slide. So often in our work, we look at other pieces of work and memorials as precedent. In this case, we look to contemporary examples of ways to spatialize and capture the narratives of slavery and injustice through memorialization. Next slide. Here, the African Burial Ground Project uncovers the forgotten role of African bodies and slavery that played in constructing colonial New York. As construction in Lower Manhattan was underway on this 34-story federal office tower in 1991, human remains were discovered during the initial excavation, which halted the construction. Archaeologists later uncovered a 6-acre burial ground containing the remains of an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 freed and enslaved Africans from the 18th century. Today, this memorial sits as the oldest and largest known excavated African burial ground in North America. The design features a sacred and sculptural granite monument serving to physically and spiritually and ritualistically, also psychologically define the location where the historic reinterpret and remains of artifacts has taken place. The inscription on the wall of the ancestral chamber reads, "For all those who are lost, for all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, for all those who were not forgotten." Next slide. The memorial to enslaved laborers informs the story of the enslaved individuals whose labor built and maintained the University of Virginia campus. Following a public apology from the institution of slavery made by the UVA's Board of Visitors in 2007, a student-led effort to further the university's conversations with truth-telling about its legacy of slavery led to the formalization of this memorial. Similar to the design that we saw in the African burial ground, this project is also constructed of local granite and organized along a concentric ring, which abstracts the broken chains of slavery. It's the reclaiming of the grounds for those that built it and giving space to memory and narratives that over time were suppressed and unspoken. Next slide. While as architects, we have experience navigating memorial work, and we are here to help you guide through reconciling and honoring these complex histories. Our own experience has found that sometimes those histories are also best narrated or collaborated with the work of an artist. So here, a column for Sally Hemings by the acclaimed artist Martin Puryear gives a modern and elegant voice to Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved mother of 6 who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate. Art historian Darby English describes the work as a piece that speaks multiple historical languages. There is that of the streaming robes that fluted columns originally meant to evoke, being that as they are proxies for the bodies of women positioned to hold everything up and to be seen doing this and nothing but. And there are many languages of iron, from the colonial to the quotidian. For the black part, tightly fitted into the white, could be said to intervene upon the latter. So through its simplicity, this memorial welcomes discomfort and evokes a sense of familiarity. Next slide. Another example of a story completed by an artist's work is seen here in this work by one of MASS's project collaborators and project partners, Hank Willis Thomas, and other artists as well. Hank Willis Thomas at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, in an interview with the art newspaper, he made the statement that we have so many memorials for war and so far so few for peace. That can't be by accident, and it's not sustainable for our psyche. The last example, Column for Sally Hemings, was an example of a memorial interpreted through abstraction. Here, contemporary examples of a more literal embodiment of memories seemingly frozen in time. The piece on the left by Hank, entitled Raise Up, is a bronze and cement sculpture based on a photograph from Ernest Cole's 1967 House of Bondage collection. The original image captured a moment of South African miners undergoing a humiliating nude group medical examination. Here, only the hands and heads rise above the plinth and stand as a reminder of modern day police brutality and racial bias in the US criminal justice system. It was essential in curating the entire memorial grounds that this piece did not stand alone. Instead, its placement is in conversation with the architecture and the sculpture of other artists seen on the right, narrating a complete memorial and memory of African-American history in America. Together, the works highlight Bryan Stevenson's thesis that slavery never ended, and there's a piece that represents the memory of the beginning of slavery, which you see on the right, the civil rights movement, which is happening in the middle, and contemporary society and police brutality, which is happening on the left. Next slide. The final precedent we'll share with you is the Whitney Plantation, which is in Wallace, Louisiana. The Whitney Plantation is the only museum in Louisiana that focuses exclusively on the lives of enslaved people, specifically the memory and honor of those who worked and lived on the plantation. Much like what we saw at the National Museum for Peace and Justice with Hank's collection, there is a collection of work here by multiple artists that tell a complete story of the lives the plantation seeks to honor and memorialize. Many of the works of art and memorials are scattered throughout the grounds, but this piece in particular is called The Children of Whitney, and it's a series of sculptures by Woodrow Nash that participate with the architecture and space of the church to narrate the stories and recollections of the memories of those who endured their lives as children in slavery. What all of those presidents show is the possibility and impact that memorials can have at a variety of scales and different mediums. At this point, we're going to actually transition into some of Mass's own memorial work, and I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brandon. Thanks very much for that. So those were all precedents from some of our colleagues and by other designers. Now we'll show you some work by Mass Design Group and by Mass Design Group's Memorial Lab. First, I'd like to share with you a project of soil collection. Mass partnered with Bryan Stevenson's organization, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, to curate a process of soil collection from the sites of lynchings all across the state of Alabama. The Equal Justice Initiative, as some of you may remember from front page news stories, perhaps as long as 8 years ago, undertook an investigation, a research into lynchings in the state and across the country, and came up with a new and expanded set of names of those who had been murdered in this way. As part of the soil collection project, descendants of those murdered in acts of racial killing have gathered, and they continue to gather to collect the soil that could very well, literally, in some sense, contain the blood and the sweat and the tears of their fairly recent ancestors. And having collected this soil and displaying it together with all these with other victims, these vessels of soil with the names and the dates of the dead upon them present us with a sober tapestry with which we must reckon. The soil itself is as varied and nuanced as the many lives that were taken by violence and terror. This memorial project illustrates that something powerful can be achieved with small and simple gestures, as may very well be the case at King's Chapel. Subsequent examples of Mass's memorial work from this are much larger, but I think this memorial in particular sort of suggests that scale and size are not a necessity for achieving something of significance. So, for instance, a larger memorial is this one. The Soil Collection Project was a prelude, in a sense, to our work with the Equal Justice Initiative on the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. This is a national memorial to victims of lynching, and it gives an initial impression of a nearly classical building with a masonry base, a field of columns, and an elongated entablature. But approaching it more closely, one views these columns, which are scaled to the body, and understands that each represents a county in the United States. And listed on each of these columns of sort are the names of the persons lynched in that county. Some counties have one or two names. Many have dozens. This realization that identity matters, that names and dates and individuals matter, is the first of what we understand to be 5 stages of transformation realized in this memorial. Walking into the memorial, as the sloping ground plane drops away from us, and what were initially understood to be columns now hang heavily above our heads, we endure discomfort, the second stage of this transformative process we postulate. And then deeper within the memorial, we come to a place of contemplation and reflection, which allows us to be proximate, the third stage, to the truth, to absorb a difficult history and its ramifications for us now. So this is our third stage of being proximate to the history, the truth of our history. And then the fourth stage we postulate in this process is to change the narrative. And here we see Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who understands that the memorial that he's created with his organization to be a healthy provocation for us as individuals and as a country, a provocation for us to revisit discomforting stories that have been swept aside or willfully perhaps misconstrued. This is our fourth step to change the narrative. And lastly, we must remain hopeful, as was noted earlier. We end by exiting out from under the bodies above us to the open sky. As Brian Stevenson has said, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And he's also said to children, hope is our superpower, as an inspirational statement. So I'll move on now to another mass design project, our gun violence memorial. The Gun Violence Memorial Project was originally commissioned for the Architecture Biennale in Chicago 2 years ago and is currently on exhibit at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. Janea Asazi, who has joined us, and I worked very closely on this project together for a little while. The project consists of 4 glass houses Each are made of 700 illusory bricks that, and each of these sort of void bricks represent one of the 700 deaths that occur from gun violence in this country every week. So in total, these houses represent the death toll in this country over the course of a month. For this memorial, Mass partnered with an artist, actually Hank Willis Thomas again, and with Purpose Over Pain, which an organization founded by two mothers who lost children to gun violence. One of the founders, Pamela Bosley, explained, as you read here, that you, quote, hear all those numbers all the time, but never tie names to them. I wanted you to see who my son was, unquote. And so to this end, in partnership with Purpose Over Pain and Hank, Mass created this project. And in this project, each void or brick will eventually contain a token of a lost life. Mass has curated a process which has been repeated in many communities around this country to collect these objects. Excuse me, I'm sorry, but I didn't mean to go on. Bibby, who's joining me today, facilitated one of these collection events in Philadelphia just a few weeks ago. And you see here that there are sadly many spaces yet to be filled in, but the collection efforts go on and the memorial continues to be completed. So now we bring you to a project that's a bit closer to home. Mass Design Group and Hank again partnered to win a design competition for the Martin Luther and Coretta Scott King Memorial, which will be dedicated on the Boston Common in January of 2023. A Boston memorial to the Kings is fitting, as many of you may know, in that the Kings met in Boston while Martin Luther King was studying philosophy and ethics at Boston University. Mass and the artists have worked closely through many, many iterations of the sculpture. And I say that having been a part of quite a long process over the last 2 years, realizing this. Hank's Hank's part of the work is the sculpture itself. Mass has been collaborating closely on the plaza that surrounds it. And our close collaboration, we hope, has resulted in a holistic design. The memorial will further honor local civil rights leaders and commemorate the Freedom Rally of 1965, which brought 20,000 people to the Boston Common. And at this event, Dr. King, speaking from the Parkman Bandstand, which is adjacent to the new memorial on the Common, took the neighborhood concerns of housing and education to the front door of the city. And he also remembered that, as he said then, little did I imagine that such a day was possible when I walked through this same Boston Common as a student 10 years ago. This will go down as one of the greatest days that Boston has ever seen. And it's taken a little while to recognize that, but we are finally there. The memorial, the sculpture, The Embrace by Hank Willis Thomas, is inspired by this photograph on the right, taken the night that Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize. Hank was moved by how it seems as if Coretta is holding Dr. King up in this photo. And he wanted to focus on the importance of how her support and their love shaped their involvement in the civil rights movement and activism. The memorial is about the Kings, but beyond this, it honors the civil rights movement and the love which connects us all and bends the arc of history towards justice. And featured in the plaza is this quotation, sort of in balance with the sculpture itself. Love is such a powerful force. It's there for everyone to embrace. That kind of unconditional love for all humankind. That is the kind of love that impels us people to go into the community and try to change conditions for others, to take risks for what they believe in. Coretta Scott King. So in 2023, we'll be able to visit that all in person. So now let me move on from those examples of memorial work by Mass Design Group to what we, in doing this work, have come to understand as the 3 phases of memorial design. This is the lens which we have developed to understand memorial work. The first of these phases we call engagement. This can involve community outreach, public input, research and development, collective processing, compiling of information. This is engagement grounds the memorial in the public consciousness. The next phase, honoring, tests the resonance of the memorial and its impact by engaging in temporary experiences, exhibitions, marking, remembering, and educating. And then this last phase of permanence not only records history, as conventional memorials do, but inspires hope and action with a permanent installation, with architecture, with sculpture, and with knowledge sharing. And an example of these 3 phases with this lens, looking back on the gun violence memorial, is we understand our engagement process to be object collection. We understand honoring to be the current manifestation of the memorial in various exhibitions. And then quite aspirationally, we understand permanence will be a larger memorialization, which reflects the scope of the national tragedy of gun violence with, as envisioned here, something on the National Mall or perhaps something in every state which suffers from gun violence. Now, using this lens once again, in a second example, we look at the soil collection project undertaken with the Equal Justice Initiative and see that as an engagement phase. The honoring phase was the exhibition of the soil collection process. And with the design and construction of the Memorial for Peace and Justice, we've achieved this state of permanence. So, having looked at all of that, what does that have to, how do we understand King's Chapel now? What are the memorial phases of design for King's Chapel? And so much work has already been done. The extensive archival research and the revelation of names and stories constitute engagement and grounds everything that might follow. Although moving forward, more work might be done to engage with communities outside the church, of course. For instance, we see honoring in King's Chapel's history program, its website and webinars, this very conversation itself, perhaps. And all of these have made the scholarship undertaken widely available. King's Chapel recognizes a need for permanence with both a physical and a living memorial. Mass Design Group will be very pleased to partner with you with the church in the creation of a physical memorial. And in this slide, which I think is our last slide, we are offering the steps towards this physical memorial. How would we move forward from here? We suggest 7 steps and 2 significant milestones. First, we are suggesting a process in January of the coming year in which we would plan working sessions for congregants to engage the process, and we would identify milestones with the committee. Next, we would establish design goals in February of 2022. In these working sessions, we would sort of ask and hope to come into alignment about some really key questions. What is the intent of the memorial? Why are we doing this? How does it situate itself within the church and within the church's history? Is it a figurative memorial in some sense? Does it include names? And there are other fundamental questions as well. Our third step would be if we decide we need an artist, and that seems likely, but if we do, we would choose an artist and a site within the church in March of 2022. We would sort of ask the questions, is the memorial interior? Is it exterior? How prominent is it within the space of the church? What spaces are currently available within the church? And what changes might need to be made to accommodate the new memorial? And how significant are those changes? A fourth step is in April, May 2022, the project concept. And this is where with an artist, if one is chosen, we develop the project scope and vision. And our intent would be to share that concept for the memorial at the May annual meeting of 2022 for the entire congregation. We then move to beyond the kind of concept phase into a phase of realization. This is where the artist and mass design group really get down to the drawing board and start to create the refinements and the documentation necessary to realize the memorial. And there would be a series of review and approval milestones during that process, June through December. We might anticipate January through March as an installation period, and perhaps dedicate this by Easter 2023. So with that, I conclude our presentation. And Miguel, I think I'll pass it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Chris, once again. So the Committee on the Permanent Memorial and the Committee on the Living Memorial in their research did a lot of investigation into precedents, some of which you'd seen tonight and some of which you didn't see tonight. But one of the most impressive ones, was the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was a memorial to which Joy had hoped to lead a group visit, but unfortunately the COVID pandemic started and it had to be canceled. And that's what led us, at that time when Joy was trying to organize a trip to Montgomery, she had no idea of who this firm was responsible or what their connections were to Boston and to King's Chapel. And that's what led us to mass design. And I think that what I want to say is that it's mass design's positive, hopeful aspect in their work that has always inspired me. I think that we don't want this memorial to be something other than, as we say, a site for reflection and a beacon of hope. So the committee has done its work, it's made its recommendation. And with that, I think the ball is passed to the congregation as a whole. And here you are, and hopefully you're just about to have a chance for a Q&A, but also to the leadership of the parish, which is represented by Kathy German. So I'm going to just turn it over to Kathy for a minute, and then you'll get some Q&A. And thank you so much for being here tonight. We've worked hard to get here, and 61 people is wonderful to see. Thanks.
Thank you, Miguel. I hope you're as excited and enthusiastic about the prospects of working with Mass Design. Obviously, the level of thought and integrity that goes into their work is outstanding, and we're very excited about the possibility. But I'm sure that you're also thinking about not just what we want to do, but why we want to do it and how we want to do it. That's a question that comes up all the time in our discussions with parishioners. It's a question that we as members of the Memorial Committee think about all the time as well. For me personally, it's the 219 names of the enslaved that were identified through our archives that compel my engagement in this initiative and my commitment to it. They were brought into the church community, both adults and children. They worshiped with the members, though not among them. And they shared the sacraments through baptism, marriage, and burial. So it's those 219 souls that move me and that I choose to remember as a symbol of so much more. That said, as a member of the King's Chapel community for the past 40 years, I personally believe that this undertaking will prove one of our most significant. First, it truly reflects our history within its cultural context. Second, it reflects the revolutionary nature of our theological transformation. And third, it provides a singular opportunity to exercise our faith as we work toward a more just and equitable society. As the fourth stop on the Freedom Trail, almost 300,000 visitors, 300,000 visitors come through our sanctuary doors every year from all corners of the city, the nation, and the world. Certainly, this will ensure that our message will be widely heard, inviting reflection and encouraging hope and engagement in building our collective future. What a moment in the arc of our story. The success of this work, however, requires widespread engagement, not only in crafting our message and sharing it through the memorial design, but also through its production. We estimate that the cost of the physical memorial is about $500,000. Not small change, but that shouldn't be surprising. First, we will seek approval for the investment of $130,000 from our society reserves. This will support our partnership with Mass Design. We see this as a key to our success as they guide us through the entire process and facilitate development so that we can move forward all the way to completion. However, we also need to fund an artist, perhaps, to help us realize the final design, followed by the fabrication of whatever it is we come up with, then the installation, and then the presentation of the memorial. Therefore, we will also seek approval of a significant investment in the project from our trustees, the stewards of the King's Chapel Trust. Of course, we will invite you, our members and friends, to support the project through your donations. And finally, with widespread parish engagement, we will have developed the capacity to seek funding from the larger philanthropic community. Through this combination of funding sources, we will know that, in fact, we are all in this together. The production of the physical memorial represents a major step forward in the realization of the memorial project, with work on the living memorial, a programmatic initiative to follow. Well, that's where we are in planning at this point. Now let's see where you are. We promised you time to share your thoughts and comments, questions and suggestions, and David Waters has graciously agreed to moderate the section of the presentation. So I will turn it over to David. Please, please weigh in. Remember to unmute yourself when you're about to speak.